Step back in time with me, to a world lit only by firelight and shadowed by fear. We're going to 1692, to a small, isolated village on the edge of a vast, unknown wilderness. Salem, Massachusetts. This wasn't the bustling America we know today. This was a place of hardship, a community clinging to survival against brutal winters, devastating diseases, and constant, gnawing anxiety. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was a society under immense pressure. Imagine waking up every morning not knowing if your crops would fail, if a new sickness would sweep through your family, or if conflict would erupt on the frontier. The world outside their small circle of log cabins and dirt roads felt hostile and dangerous. Adintotis, their political situation was precarious. Their royal charter, the very document that gave them the right to govern themselves, was in jeopardy, leaving them in a state of legal and political limbo. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It struck at the heart of their identity and their sense of security. Who was in charge? What were the rules? No one seemed to know for sure. Into this cauldron of uncertainty, you pour a heavy dose of fervent, unwavering Puritan faith. For the people of Salem, the world was a battlefield between God and the devil. They believed Satan was a real, active force, constantly seeking to tempt, corrupt, and destroy their city upon a hill. Every misfortune, from a sick cow to a child's fever, could be interpreted as a sign of God's displeasure or, more terrifyingly, the devil's handiwork. There was no room for coincidence. Everything had a supernatural explanation. This belief system wasn't just a part of their lives. It was their life. It shaped their every thought, their every action, their every fear. It all began in the cold, bleak winter of 1692, in the home of the village minister, Reverend Samuel Paris. His 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and his 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, started behaving strangely. They would contort their bodies into unnatural positions, scream as if in agony, and make guttural, choking sounds. Soon, other young women in the village, like an Putnam Jr., began to exhibit the same terrifying symptoms. The local doctor, William Griggs, was baffled. After ruling out any physical illness he could identify, he offered a chilling diagnosis to girls were under an evil hand. They were bewitched. The community was thrown into a panic. The question was an asterisk. If asterisk, there were witches. But asterisk, who asterisk? Under intense pressure from the village magistrates, the afflicted girls began to name names. The first 3 accused were women on the fringes of Salem society. Easy targets for a community looking for someone to blame. There was Sarah Good, a homeless woman who begged dirt. There was Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who had been involved in disputes over her late husband's estate. And then there was Taitaba, the Paris family's enslaved servant from the Caribbean. Initially, all 3 denied the charges, but Taitaba, likely facing severe coercion and understanding her vulnerable position, changed her story. She confessed, but she didn't just confess to witchcraft. She wove a terrifying and elaborate tale. She spoke of signing the devil's book, of flying on a stick, and of a conspiracy of witches right there in Salem, all plotting to destroy the Puritans. Her confession was like throwing gasoline on a fire. It confirmed everyone's worst fears. The devil was not just a distant threat. He was here, among them, and he had followers. Taitaba's story, a mix of Puritan beliefs and possibly her own cultural folklore, gave the magistrates what they were looking for. Proof. The hunt was on. With Taitaba's confession, the floodgates opened. The accusations began to multiply, spreading like a contagion through Salem and the surrounding towns. The afflicted girls, now elevated to the status of rock star witnesses, became the central figures in the unfolding drama. In the courtroom, their performances were riveting and terrifying. They would writhe on the floor, scream in pain, and claim to see the spectral shapes of the accused tormenting them. "Look, there is Goody Proctor on the beam." One would cry, and the entire room would gasp in horror. These spectral visions, the idea that a witch could send her spirit out to harm others, were accepted as legitimate evidence. Think about the sheer power these young women suddenly held. In a society where women, especially young women, were expected to be silent and subservient. They were now the most important people in the room. Their words could lead to arrest, imprisonment, and even death. The accused, on the other hand, were trapped in an impossible situation. If they denied the charges, the girls' fits would often intensify, seen as further proof of their guilt. The magistrates would demand, "Why do you hurt these children?" Denials were futile. The only way out seemed to be to confess. Confessing, however, created a new nightmare. To save their own lives, confessed witches were pressured to name other witches, to point fingers at their friends and neighbors. This led to a devastating chain reaction. Accusations flew, fueled by old family feuds, property disputes, and personal grudges. Did you have an argument with your neighbor over a stray pig? They might be a witch. Did you resent someone's financial success? They could be in league with the devil. The trials devolved into a way to settle old scores, and the social fabric of the community began to tear apart at the seams. Respectable, church-going members of the community, like Rebecca Nurse and John Proctor, found themselves accused and in chains, their reputations and lives hanging by a thread. The first official execution took place on June 10, 1692. Bridget Bishop, an older woman known for her somewhat flamboyant dress and for owning a tavern, was hanged on Gallows Hill. Her death marked a point of no return. Over the next few months, the madness escalated. 19 men and women were hanged as witches. Several others died in the squalid, disease-ridden prisons. And then there was the case of Giles Corey, an 81-year-old farmer. He refused to enter a plea of guilty or not guilty, knowing that either way his property would be forfeited, leaving his family with nothing. To force a plea, the court subjected him to a brutal form of torture called peni forte, doer, where heavy stones were piled on his chest. For 2 days, he endured the agony, his only response to their demands being more weight. He died under the crushing stones, a defiant martyr in a world gone mad. By the autumn of 1692, doubts began to surface. The jails were overflowing. The accusations were reaching ever higher into society, even targeting the wife of the governor, Lady Mary Phipps, the educated elite in Boston, including influential ministers like Increase Smith, started to publicly question the proceedings. They argued that spectral evidence was unreliable. How could you trust the visions of hysterical girls? The devil, they reasoned, could just as easily take the shape of an innocent person to cause chaos. This was a crucial turning point. The legal and theological foundation of the trials was beginning to crumble. Finally, in October, Governor Phipps stepped in. He ordered a halt to the proceedings of the special court and established a new superior court of judicature to handle the remaining cases. Crucially, he forbade the use of spectral evidence. Without the girls' dramatic testimonies about invisible attackers, the cases fell apart. The remaining accused were acquitted, and in May 1693, Governor Phipps issued a general pardon for everyone who was still imprisoned on witchcraft charges. Just as quickly as it began, the fever of the Salem witch trials broke. The nightmare was over. In the years that followed, the colony grappled with a profound sense of shame and regret. Judges and jurors issued public apologies. Samuel Sewell, one of the main magistrates, stood silently in his Boston church while his confession of error and guilt was read aloud, asking for forgiveness. In 1711, the colony passed a bill restoring the good names of many of the accused and offered financial compensation to their families. It was a tacit admission that a terrible injustice had been done, but no apology or amount of money could bring back the dead or erase the deep scars left on the community. The Salem witch trials serve as one of history's most powerful cautionary tales. It's a story about the dangers of mass hysteria, the deadly consequences of religious extremism when mixed with state power, and the terrifying speed at which fear can erode a community's reason and compassion. It reminds us that when we allow fear to dictate our actions, when we look for scapegoats to blame for our problems, and when we abandon due process and the presumption of innocence, the results can be catastrophic. The ghosts of 1692 are a permanent reminder to question authority, to think critically, and to always stand up for justice, especially for the most vulnerable among us. Thank you so much for journeying back in time with me today. If you found this story as fascinating and important as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into history's most compelling moments. Let me know in the comments what you think is the most important lesson from Salem. See you next time. Have you ever heard a story so bizarre, so chilling, that it's hard to believe it actually happened? Today, we're journeying back to the year 1692, to a small, isolated community called Salem Village in Colonial, Massachusetts. This isn't just a ghost story. It's a dark chapter of American history that began in the most peculiar way. Imagine a cold winter. The world outside is harsh, and inside, life is governed by strict Puritan beliefs. In the home of Reverend Samuel Parris, something strange starts to happen. His 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and his 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, begin to exhibit terrifying behaviors. They would scream uncontrollably, contort their bodies into unnatural positions, and speak in what sounded like gibberish. Sometimes they'd complain of being pricked by invisible pins or bitten by specters. Soon, other young women in the village, like Putnam Jr. and Mercy Lewis, started showing the same symptoms. They'd have violent fits, throw things, and seem to be in a trance. Their families were terrified. The local doctor, William Griggs, was Cayetin, but he could find no physical cause for their ailments. After examining them, he offered a diagnosis that would ignite a firestorm of fear. The girls were under an evil hand. In other words, they were bewitched. In a community that deeply believed in the devil's power to work through humans, this diagnosis was like a lit match in a dry forest. The question wasn't asterisk. If asterisk, there were witches, but asterisk, who? Asterisk, they were. Pressured to name their tormentors, the afflicted girls began to point fingers. The first 3 accused were women on the fringes of Salem society. There was Taitaba, Peperi's family's enslaved woman from the Caribbean, whose different culture and stories of magic made her an easy target. Then there was Sarah Good, a homeless woman who often begged her tutor and muttered under her breath when turned away. And finally, Sarah Osborne, an elderly, bedridden woman who had social disputes over property and hadn't attended church in over a year. These first 3 accusations set a dangerous precedent. They were outcasts, people who didn't quite fit the rigid Puritan mold. They were vulnerable. When brought before the magistrates, Jonathan Corwin and John Hathorne, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, fiercely maintained their innocence, but their denials were met with skepticism. The afflicted girls would writhe and scream in the courtroom, claiming the specters of the accused were tormenting them right there. This spectral evidence was considered proof of guilt. Taitaba's testimony, however, changed everything. After likely being coerced and possibly tortured, she confessed. But she didn't just confess to witchcraft. She spun a vivid, terrifying tale. She spoke of signing the devil's book, of riding on a stick through the night to attend secret meetings. And most alarmingly, she claimed there were other witches in Salem Village, working alongside her. She described a conspiracy of evil, confirming the community's worst fears. Her confession was exactly what the panicked villagers wanted to hear. It validated their belief that a satanic plot was unfolding in their midst. The hunt was no longer for a few isolated individuals. It was for a coven of witches, threatening to destroy their godly society from within. This lit the fuse for the hysteria that would follow. The accusations began to multiply, spreading like a contagion from person to person, neighbor to neighbor. The circle of the accused widened rapidly. It was no longer just social outcasts. Respected members of the community were next. Martha Corey, a devout churchgoer who had openly criticized the trials and expressed disbelief in the girls' claims, was accused. Her skepticism was seen not as rational, but as proof that she herself was a witch trying to cover her tracks. Her arrest sent a shockwave through the community. If someone like Martha Corey could be a witch, then anyone could be. Then came Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old, highly regarded matriarch known for her piety and kindness. Her accusation was met with disbelief by many. A petition was signed by dozens of her neighbors testifying to her good character. Even during her trial, the jury initially returned a verdict of not guilty. But the courtroom erupted. The judges, under immense pressure, asked the jury to reconsider. Confused and intimidated, they changed their verdict to guilty. Rebecca Nurse was sentenced to hang. This was a turning point. The accusation of Rebecca Nurse demonstrated that no one was safe. Piety, good reputation, and community standing were no longer a defense. The logic became twisted. If you denied being a witch, it was because you were trying to hide your guilt. If you were skeptical of the proceedings, you must be part of the conspiracy. Fear and paranoia gripped Salem completely. The accusations started to reflect existing village rivalries, property disputes, and family feuds. The Putnam family, for example, was a key driving force behind many of the accusations. They were involved in long-standing land disputes with other families, and many of their rivals found themselves accused of witchcraft. It became a way to settle old scores under the cover of religious righteousness. If you had an enemy, you could simply claim their specter was tormenting you, and the courts would listen. The legal system itself was woefully unprepared. The magistrates accepted spectral evidence, the testimony of the afflicted girls that they were being attacked by the ghostly shapes of the accused fact. This was impossible to disprove. How can you defend yourself against something that no one else can see? The accused were trapped in a horrifying catch-22. If they confessed, they were spared execution, but had to live with the shame and often had their property confiscated. If they maintained their innocence, as many brave individuals did, they were almost certain to be found guilty and hanged. This is how a small spark of strange behavior in a handful of girls exploded into a full-blown witch hunt. It wasn't just superstition. It was a perfect storm of religious extremism, social anxiety, personal vendettas, and a legal system that failed its people. The accusations created a wave of terror that would ultimately lead to the imprisonment of over 150 people and the execution of 20, forever staining the name of Salem. It stands as a powerful reminder of how quickly fear can overwhelm reason, and how vital it is to protect justice and truth, especially when we are afraid. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the past. It's a complex and somber story, but one we need to remember. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more historical stories. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time. Have you ever had a nightmare so vivid it felt real? What if that nightmare could be used as evidence to condemn someone to death? It sounds like something out of a horror movie, but in 1692, in the small Puritan village of Salem, Massachusetts, this terrifying concept became reality. This is the story of how fear became law, and how spectral evidence turned a community against itself. Our story begins in the cold winter of 1692, in the home of Reverend Samuel Parris. His daughter, Betty, and niece, Abigail Williams, started exhibiting bizarre behaviors. Tay screamed through things, uttered strange sounds, and contorted their bodies into painful positions. A local doctor, unable to find any physical cause, suggested a supernatural origin. The diagnosis? Witchcraft. The girls, under pressure from magistrates Jonathan Corwin and John Hathorne, began to name names. The first three accused were Tituba, Rebecca Paris, enslaved woman from the Caribbean, Sarah Good, a homeless beggar, and Sarah Osborne, an elderly, impoverished woman who rarely attended church. They were easy targets, social outcasts who fit the Puritan image of what a witch might be. During the examinations, a new and terrifying form of proof was introduced. Spectral evidence. This was testimony from the afflicted girls that the accused person's spirit, or specter, was tormenting them. They claimed these invisible phantoms were pinching them, choking them, and tempting them to sign the devil's book. Think about that for a moment. The only evidence was the accuser's own experience, a dream, a vision, a feeling. There was no physical proof. Nothing anyone else could see or verify. It was one person's word against another's, but in the frenzy of Salem, the accusers were always believed. This created a horrifying legal precedent. How do you defend yourself against something that's invisible? How do you prove your spirit was untorturing someone while your physical body was locked in a jail cell? You couldn't. The court accepted these visions as fact. The line between the spiritual world and the physical world completely dissolved. Justice was no longer about facts and logic. It was about belief and hysteria. Bridget Bishop was the first person to be tried and executed based on this flimsy evidence. Her accusers claimed her specter tormented them in their beds. They even said her specter appeared as a black pig or a headless demon. In court, whenever Bridget would look at the afflicted girls, they would fall into fits, as if struck by an invisible blow. This was seen as undeniable proof of her guilt. On June 10, 1692, Bridget Bishop was hanged on Gallows Hill, a stark warning to all who stood accused. The situation spiraled out of control. Spectral evidence created a perfect storm for personal vendettas and social climbing. Did you have a dispute with your neighbor over a piece of land? Accuse them of witchcraft. Did you owe someone money? Claim their specter was tormenting you. The trials became a stage 4, settling old scores, fueled by jealousy, greed, and deep-seated grudges. The courtroom became a theater of the absurd. Accusers would writhe and scream, pointing at the defendant, claiming their specter was attacking them right there and then. The judges and the public, gripped by fear, saw it as undeniable confirmation of guilt. Imagine the paranoia. Anyone could be next. Respected church members, wealthy landowners, even a former minister, George Burroughs, were accused. Burroughs was a man of great physical strength, and his accusers claimed his power came from the devil. During his execution, he stood on the ladder and perfectly recited the Lord's Prayer, something a witch was supposedly unable to do. The crowd wavered, thinking an innocent man was about to be killed. But influential Minister Cotton Mather, a strong believer in the trials, told the crowd that the devil could disguise himself as an angel of light. And so, George Burroughs was hanged. The core of the problem was a legal system that had abandoned its principles. The accused were presumed guilty from the start. If you confessed to witchcraft, you were spared execution, but you had to name other witches, perpetuating the cycle of accusations. If you maintained your innocence, you were likely to be condemned and executed. It was a no-win situation. Giles Corey, an elderly farmer, famously refused to enter a plea at all. As punishment, he was subjected to pena forte et dure, where heavy stones were piled on his chest to force a plea. His last words were defiant. More weight. He died after 2 days, but his refusal to plead meant his property could be passed on to his sons, rather than being seized by the state. So, when did it all end? The turning point came when the accusations started reaching the upper echelons of society, including the wife of Governor William Phips. Suddenly, the powerful elite who had endorsed the trials began to question their validity. Governor Phips finally intervened in October 1692. He ordered a halt to the proceedings and disbanded the local court. He replaced it with a superior court of judicature, which, crucially, disallowed spectral evidence. Without the invisible proof, the cases fell apart. The remaining prisoners were released over the next several months, and the Salem witch trials came to an end. In total, over 200 people were accused, and 20 were executed. The legacy of Salem is a chilling reminder of what can happen when fear is allowed to overrule reason, when belief is accepted as evidence, and when a justice system fails its people. It shows how easily a community can be torn apart by mass hysteria and moral panic. The story of Salem teaches us a vital lesson about the importance of due process, the separation of belief from law, and the danger of allowing paranoia to dictate our actions. It's a dark chapter in history, but one we must never forget, to ensure that fear is never again allowed to become law. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story as fascinating and important as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most compelling moments. Let me know in the comments what you think about the use of spectral evidence. We'll see you in the next video. Imagine living in a world where a whisper could be a death sentence, where your neighbor's fear, your refusal to conform, or even a simple misunderstanding could lead you to the gallows. This wasn't a far-off fantasy. It was the chilling reality for the people of Salem, Massachusetts, in 1692. Today, we're not just talking about history. We're remembering the lives lost to a wave of hysteria that swept through a small Puritan community. We're going to uncover the stories of the victims, the real people behind the infamous Salem witch trials. So, how did it all begin? It started, as these things often do, with fear and suspicion. In the cold winter of 1692, a group of young girls, including the daughter and niece of Reverend Samuel Parris, began to exhibit strange behaviors. They screamed, threw things, and contorted their bodies into odd positions. A local doctor, unable to find a physical cause, declared they were bewitched. The hunt for the witches had begun. The first to be accused were 3 women who were already outsiders in the community. Tituba, Reverend Parris's enslaved servant from the Caribbean. Sarah Good, a homeless beggar, and Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who rarely attended church and was involved in a property dispute. Under intense pressure and likely coercion, Tituba confessed to witchcraft, describing fantastical scenes of flying on sticks and meeting with the devil. Her confession was like throwing gasoline on a fire. It validated the community's fears and opened the floodgates for more accusations. Sarah Good, however, maintained her innocence to the very end. Even her 4-year-old daughter, Dorcas, was accused and imprisoned, a haunting testament to the scope of the paranoia. Sarah Osborne would never face trial. She died in prison, a victim of the harsh conditions. But for Sarah Good, her fate was sealed. On July 19, 1692, as she stood on the gallows, a minister urged her to confess. Her final words were defiant and powerful. "I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." From these first 3 accusations, the hysteria spiraled out of control. It was no longer just marginalized women being accused. The net widened to include respected members of the community. Rebecca Nurse was a 71-year-old, pious grandmother, known for her charity and good standing. When she was accused, 39 of her neighbors signed a petition attesting to her good character. The jury initially found her not guilty, but the courtroom erupted in protest. The magistrates asked the jury to reconsider, pointing out a remark she made that was misinterpreted as a confession. Confused and hard of hearing, Rebecca didn't respond adequately. The verdict was changed. She was hanged alongside Sarah Good. Her story is a tragic example of how public pressure and judicial weakness could condemn even the most unlikely of witches. Think about it, a beloved matriarch of the community, executed because of mass panic and a flawed legal process. Her family had to retrieve her body in secret at night to give her a proper Christian burial on their family homestead. Then there was Bridget Bishop, the very first person to be executed in the trials. Bridget was a bit of a character. She was known for her colorful clothing, her sharp tongue, and for owning a tavern where people could drink and play games. In the strict Puritan society of Salem, she stood out, and not in a good way. She didn't fit the mold of a demure Puritan woman, and that made her an easy target. Accusations against her weren't new. She'd been accused of witchcraft years earlier, but was acquitted. This time, she wasn't so lucky. The spectral evidence, the testimony of the accusers that Bishop's spirit was tormenting them, was a key part of the case against her. Despite her firm denials, she was found guilty and hanged on June 10th. Her story highlights how nonconformity could be twisted into something sinister. But it wasn't only women. Men were also caught in this web of lies. John Proctor, a successful farmer and tavern keeper, was one of the most prominent male victims. He was outspoken in his criticism of the trials, calling the afflicted girls liars and scammers. This skepticism made him a target when his own servant, Mary Warren, began to have fits. Proctor threatened her, and she in turn accused him of witchcraft. Soon, his pregnant wife Elizabeth was also accused. John Proctor wrote a desperate letter from prison, begging the Boston clergy to intervene. He described the torture used to extract confessions, pleading for a change of venue or for more impartial judges. His plea fell on deaf ears. While his wife's execution was delayed because of her pregnancy, John Proctor was hanged on August 19th. His story is a powerful reminder of the danger of speaking out against a popular frenzy. He tried to be the voice of reason, and for that, he paid with his life. Perhaps one of the most brutal and unique cases was that of Giles Corey. He was an 81-year-old farmer with a somewhat cantankerous reputation. When he was accused of witchcraft, he refused to enter a plea of guilty or not guilty. Why? Because he knew that if he did, and was found guilty, the law stated that his property and land would be confiscated by the state, leaving his children with nothing. By refusing to plead, he could not be legally tried. The court's response was a medieval and horrifying form of torture, peine forte, et dure, or pressing. For 2 days, Giles Corey was laid in a field with a wooden board on his chest, while heavy stones were piled on top of him, one by one, to force a plea. He endured it all in silence. His only words, when asked to plead, were reportedly more weight. He died under the immense pressure, but he won his final battle. He was never convicted of a crime, and his farm passed to his sons-in-law, as he had willed. His death was so shocking that it is often cited as a turning point in public opinion against the trials. Let's pause and reflect on the numbers. Over the course of about a year, more than 200 people were accused. 19 were hanged on Gallows Hill. Giles Corey was pressed to death. At least 5 others, like Sarah Osborne, died in the squalor of the prisons. Entire families were devastated. Reputations built over a lifetime were shattered in an instant. Children were orphaned, and the community was left with a legacy of shame and regret that lingers to this day. The victims were not monsters. They were farmers, mothers, grandfathers, and tavern keepers. Some were outcasts, and some were pillars of their community. What they had in common was being in the wrong place at the wrong time, caught in a perfect storm of religious extremism, social anxiety, and a legal system that accepted delusion as fact. Their stories are a chilling warning from history about the dangers of mass hysteria, the failure of critical thinking, and what happens when we allow fear to overpower reason and compassion. Eventually, the tide did turn. Influential figures like Governor William Phipps, whose own wife was eventually accused, began to question the proceedings, especially the reliance on spectral evidence. In October 1692, he ordered a halt to the trials and established a new court that disallowed such flimsy testimony. The remaining prisoners were released over the next several months. Years later, the colony officially apologized. Jurors and accusers, including one of the most prominent, Ann Putnam Jr., issued public confessions of guilt and regret. In 1711, the colony passed a bill restoring the good names of many of the victims and providing some financial restitution to their families. But no amount of money or words could ever bring back the lives that were so unjustly taken. As we look back at the Salem witch trials, it's crucial to remember the individuals: Bridget Bishop, Rebecca Noose, John Proctor, Giles Corey, Sarah Good, and all the others. They were not just names in a history book. They were people with lives, families, and futures that were stolen from them by lies. Their tragedy serves as a timeless lesson for us all to guard against prejudice, to question authority, and to stand up for justice, even when it's unpopular. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back in time to honor these lives. If you found this story compelling, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. Let me know in the comments which victim's story resonated with you the most. Stay curious, and we'll see you in the next video. Hello history lovers, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're delving into the final, tragic chapter of the Salem witch trials, a period where the madness began to unravel, but far too late for many. We've talked about how the accusations began, how they snowballed. But what happens when a society built on faith and order realizes it has been tearing itself apart based on lies and hysteria? Let's explore the collapse of one of America's darkest episodes. By the late spring of 1692, the initial wave of accusations against social outcasts had given way to something far more terrifying. The circle of the accused widened dramatically, and suddenly, no one was safe. The afflicted girls were no longer just pointing fingers at the poor or the disliked. They began naming names that sent shockwaves through the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Respected, church-going, landowning citizens found themselves in the crosshairs. One of the most significant turning points was the accusation against Rebecca Nurse. She was a 71-year-old grandmother, deeply religious, and widely regarded as a pillar of the community. When her name was mentioned, many villagers couldn't believe it. They signed a petition attesting to her good character, a brave act in such a paranoid atmosphere. Initially, the jury even found her not guilty, but the magistrates and the courtroom spectators reacted with such outrage that the jury was pressured to reconsider. They came back with a guilty verdict. Rebecca Nurse was hanged on July 19, 1692. Her execution was a profound crack in the foundation of the trials. If someone as pious and respected as Rebecca Nurse could be a witch, then literally anyone could. The very people who had supported the trials began to feel a deep sense of unease. Then came the accusation against John Proctor, a successful tavern keeper, an outspoken critic of the trials from the very beginning. He had called the afflicted girls frauds, and had even suggested corporal punishment might cure them of their afflictions. His skepticism made him a target. When his own servant, Mary Warren, one of the accusers, began to falter and admit they were lying, the other girls turned on her, accusing her of witchcraft to silence her. To save herself, Mary Warren recanted her confession and accused Proctor himself. John Proctor and his pregnant wife, Elizabeth, were both arrested. Despite a powerful petition from his neighbors, he was convicted and hanged. His final letter from prison is a heartbreaking plea, not for his own life, but for the trials to be moved to Boston, hoping for a more impartial hearing. He saw the Salem court for what it was, a machine of vengeance and fear. But perhaps the most shocking case was that of Reverend George Burroughs, a former minister of Salem Village. Burroughs was a man of God, a Harvard graduate. Yet, he was accused of being the ringleader of the witches, a sort of devilish puppet master. The evidence against him was absurd. He was accused of supernatural strength because he could supposedly lift a heavy musket with one hand. During his trial, he flawlessly recited the Lord's Prayer, something a witch was believed to be incapable of doing. The crowd was so moved that it seemed a riot might break out to save him. But the influential minister Cotton Mather, who was present, reminded the crowd that the devil could disguise himself as an angel of light. Burroughs was hanged. The execution of a minister by the very system meant to uphold religious order was a step too far for many. The moral authority of the trials was crumbling. As the fall of 1692 approached, the accusations became even more audacious. The afflicted girls, now wielding immense power, began to accuse the wives of prominent officials, including the wife of Governor William Phips himself. This was a critical misstep. Up until this point, the political elite had largely supported or, at the very least, allowed the trials to continue. But when the fire of accusation began to lick at their own doorsteps, their perspective changed rapidly. It's one thing to believe in rooting out evil from the fringes of society. It's another entirely when your own family is threatened by the same unchecked hysteria. Governor Phips, who had been away dealing with military matters, returned to find the colony in chaos. The jails were overflowing with accused individuals. The harvest was being neglected because so many people were either in jail or caught up in the legal proceedings, and a growing chorus of influential ministers and merchants from Boston and beyond were urging him to intervene. One of the most powerful voices was Increase Mather, the father of Cotton Mather and the president of Harvard College. He published a sermon titled Cases of Conscience Concerning Evil Spirits, which powerfully argued against the use of spectral evidence. He famously wrote, "It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned." This was a direct challenge to the legal basis of the entire Salem proceedings. Faced with this mounting pressure from both the public and the intellectual elite, Governor Phips took decisive action. In October 1692, he ordered a halt to the proceedings in the court of Oyez and Terminer. He dissolved the court and established a new superior court of judicature to handle the remaining cases. Crucially, this new court was instructed not to admit spectral evidence, the visions of the afflicted that had been the primary proof of guilt. Without spectral evidence, the prosecution's cases fell apart. Of the dozens tried by the new court, only 3 were convicted, and Governor Phips pardoned them, along with everyone still in jail. The Salem witch trials were officially over, but the end of the trials was not the end of the story. The aftermath was a long, painful reckoning for the community of Salem and the entire colony. The cost was immense. 19 people had been hanged. One man, Giles Corey, had been pressed to death for refusing to enter a plea, and at least 5 others had died in the deplorable prison conditions. Families were shattered, fortunes were lost, and reputations were ruined forever. The community was left with an indelible scar of guilt and shame. What followed was a period of public apology and attempts at reconciliation, something quite remarkable for the 17th century. In 1697, the General Court of Massachusetts ordered a day of fasting and prayer for the tragedy of the Salem trials. Samuel Sewell, one of the judges, stood up in his Boston church while his public apology was read aloud, accepting the blame and shame for his role and praying for forgiveness. In 1702, the court declared the trials unlawful. In 1706, Ann Putnam, Jr., one of the most prominent of the afflicted girls, stood before her church in Salem Village and offered a public apology. She claimed she had been deluded by Satan into accusing innocent people, particularly Rebecca Nurse. She lived out the rest of her life in relative obscurity, a lonely figure haunted by her past. In 1711, the colony passed a bill to restore the good names of many of the victims and offered financial compensation to their families. It was a meager sum, and it couldn't bring back the dead or erase the trauma, but it was a formal admission of a terrible wrong. The story of the Salem witch trials became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the dangers of extremism, mass hysteria, and the failure of the rule of law. It showed how fear, combined with a breakdown of due process, could lead a rational, deeply religious society to commit horrific injustices. The return of reason came too late for the victims, but the lessons learned from its absence have echoed through American history ever since, a permanent scar on the nation's conscience. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into a dark but important chapter of history. It's a story with lessons that are still incredibly relevant today. If you found this video insightful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more historical explorations. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're journeying back in time to a dark chapter in American history, one that continues to echo through the centuries, the Salem witch trials. But this isn't just a history lesson. We are going to unpack the enduring legacy of Salem and explore the powerful lessons it holds for us, even today. What happened in that small Puritan village in 1692 wasn't just about witches. It was about fear, power, and the terrifying speed at which a community can unravel. So, let's set the scene. Imagine living in Colonial, Massachusetts in the late 17th century. Life is hard. You're facing harsh winters, the constant threat of disease, conflict with Native American tribes, and a rigid, deeply religious society where the devil is believed to be a very real and active presence in daily life. Your world is small, your beliefs are absolute, and there's a constant, underlying anxiety. It's into this pressure cooker of fear and uncertainty that the first accusations of witchcraft are thrown. It all started in the home of Reverend Samuel Parris. His daughter Betty and his niece, Abigail Williams, began to exhibit strange behaviors, uncontrollable screaming, contortions, and what was described as fits. A local doctor, unable to find a physical cause, declared them to be bewitched. The girls, under pressure from the adults, named their accusers. A woman named Tituba, who was enslaved in the Parris household, Sarah Good, a homeless beggar, and Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who rarely attended church. Here's where things escalate, and we see our first critical lesson: the danger of a flawed justice system. The initial examinations weren't about finding truth. They were about confirming a pre-existing belief in witchcraft. The magistrates, Jonathan Cohen and John Hathorne, used leading questions. They asked things like, "Who is it that torments you?" Not, "Is someone tormenting you?" The burden of proof was completely reversed. The accused were considered guilty until they could prove their innocence, which was an impossible task. If they denied the charges, their denial was seen as further proof of their cunning and allegiance with the devil. The only way out was to confess, and, crucially, to name other witches. This created a horrifying domino effect. Tituba, likely under duress and physical coercion, confessed. She wove a fantastical tale of a pact with the devil, of a black man who made her sign his book, and of other witches in the village. Her confession opened the floodgates. It validated the community's fears and gave the accusers a terrifying new power. Suddenly, anyone could be next. A personal grudge, a dispute over land, or simply not fitting in could land you in chains. The accusations spread like wildfire, from the socially outcast to respected church members like Rebecca Nurse, an elderly and devout woman. This brings us to the second major lesson from Salem: the terrifying power of mass hysteria. Think of it as a social contagion. Fear and suspicion became the currency of the town. Once a few people started believing in the accusations, it became socially dangerous not asterisks to believe. To question the proceedings was to risk being accused yourself. This is how groupthink takes hold. Logic and reason are abandoned in favor of the emotional, collective panic. The spectral evidence. The accusers' claims that they were being tormented by the ghostly specters of the accused was accepted as undeniable fact. This is a chilling example of how easily objective reality can be distorted when a group is consumed by a shared delusion. People weren't just seeing what they wanted to see. They were seeing what they were expected asterisks to see. The special court of Oye and Terminer, which means to hear and to determine, was established to handle the overwhelming number of cases. Led by Lieutenant Governor William Stoughton, the court continued to accept spectral evidence as the primary basis for conviction. This was a fatal flaw. It meant that the only evidence against the accused was the word of their accusers. There was no defense against it. How can you prove that your spirit didn't fly across town to torment someone in their sleep? You can't. Between June and September of 1692, the convictions and executions came swiftly. The first person to be hanged was Bridget Bishop. Following her, 18 others would meet the same fate, including the respected minister George Burroughs, who recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly on the Galasam Singh, which was supposedly unable to do. His execution deeply troubled the crowd, but it wasn't enough to stop the momentum. Another man, Giles Corey, an 81-year-old farmer, refused to enter a plea. In a final, brutal act of the court, he was pressed to death with heavy stones over 2 days. His final words were, "More weight." So, what finally brought this madness to an end? It wasn't a sudden return to reason. It was when the accusations started to reach the top rungs of society. The accusers grew bolder, naming people who were wealthy, powerful, and even the wife of the governor, Sir William Phipps. Suddenly, the elite who had allowed the trials to happen were threatened themselves. Governor Phipps intervened, dissolving the court of Ogier and Terminer in October 1692. He replaced it with a new court that disallowed spectral evidence. Without it, the cases fell apart. The remaining prisoners were released, and the Salem witch trials were over. But the story doesn't end there. The legacy is what truly matters. In the years that followed, Salem was a community shrouded in shame and regret. In 1697, the General Court ordered a day of fasting and prayer for the tragedy. Samuel Sewell, one of the judges, stood up in his church and publicly confessed his error and guilt, asking for forgiveness from God and the community. In 1702, the court declared the trials, and in 1711, the colony passed a bill restoring the good names of many of the accused and providing some financial compensation to their heirs. It was an admission that the state had committed a terrible injustice. The Salem witch trials have become a powerful metaphor in our culture. They're a cautionary tale about the dangers of combining religious extremism with state power. When the line between church and state blurs, who is there to protect the rights of the individual? Salem shows us what happens when dogma overrules due process. It's also a profound lesson in the danger of othering, of scapegoating a group of people for the problems of a society. The first accused were outsiders, people on the margins. It was easy to believe the worst of them. But as we've seen throughout history, from the Holocaust to the Red Scare of the 1950s witch playwright, Arthur Miller famously allegorized in his play The Crucible, once a society starts scapegoating, it's a very slippery slope. It creates a climate where fear overrides compassion and injustice is allowed to flourish. Even today, we see echoes of Salem. Think about the spread of misinformation on social media, the speed at which online mobs can form to cancel someone, or how political rhetoric can whip up fear and division. Salem teaches us to be critical thinkers. It warns us to question authority, to demand evidence, and to be wary of anyone who claims to have absolute certainty, especially when that certainty is used to condemn others. The story of Salem is a reminder that the institutions we rely on for justice are only as strong as the people who run them and the principles they uphold. It highlights the incredible courage it takes to stand against the crowd, like John Proctor, who died to protect his name and his integrity, or those who spoke out against the proceedings at great personal risk. In the end, the legacy of Salem isn't just a dark mark on American history. It's a vital, ongoing lesson. It's a call for empathy, a demand for due process, and a warning against the seductive power of fear and blind belief. It reminds us that justice is fragile, that societies can make monstrous errors, and that we must remain vigilant in protecting reason, truth, and the rights of every individual. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the legacy of the Salem witch trials. It's a complex and somber topic, but one I think is incredibly important to understand. What are your thoughts on the lessons we can learn from Salem? Let me know in the comments below. And if you found this video insightful, please give it a like and consider subscribing for more content just like this. We'll see you in the next one.